Hello learners, I'm Anju Sehgal Gupta and today I'm going to be talking about an introduction to communication. As students of management, you probably need to communicate effectively more than others. Everybody needs to communicate effectively. But for you, it is a question of upward mobility, about convincing your customers, about dealing with all kinds of people. So let's talk about what is communication. Communication, as you all know, involves two or more persons who have to exchange their views, ideas and plans through an interaction, and this interaction could be a conversation, meeting, or these days through social media. So Oxford University Dictionary defines communication as imparting or exchanging information by speaking, writing or using other media. And then communication is actually described by these questions and answers to these questions. Who are the interlocutors? What are they trying to convey to each other? Through which channel? To whom? And to what effect? So these questions are something that we all need to answer in this whole process of communication. So let's talk about information technology, because that is the name of the game. In modern times, IT has revolutionized communication through a variety of media. It's much more fast and it's much more effective. We have the use of smartphones, WhatsApp, Skype, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram and many more. And of course, email has replaced classical letter writing, so that's really fast and you can attach other documents such as and also the same communication and documents can be sent to many recipients. So we are all familiar with this. Then there are the macro functions of communication. There's of course the emotive function, because communication is not only about writing or social media, or it's also about speaking. So you all often communicate your inner states and emotions. You have the directive function, which is behavior which affects others. For example, close the door please. So somebody has to close the door. You have the phatic function, which is like, hello, is it Thomas Cook? Can you hear me, Mrs. Gupta? So you're actually checking whether the whole channel is working. Then the poetic function, we all know about that, and that's the aesthetic function of language. The referential function is to carry information. The metalinguistic function, which is focusing on the code itself, focusing on the language itself. So is the language okay? Is it formal? Is it informal? Then the contextual function. So creating a particular kind of context. So if it's a meeting, you'll say, right, let's start the meeting now, if you're the boss. Then there is of course internal and external communications in an organization. So communication of course starts with the sender. And the internal communication may originate from the director or the manager or the group leader. It can also originate from the lower level of hierarchy. So it could be a worker, co-worker, subordinate who may seek information, clarification, redressal of some grievance. Then of course external communication. So when you're replying to a supplier or vendor, or the vendor or supplier is seeking an order for supply of raw materials. Customers and retailers probably want to, but hopefully not, complain about a product purchased. And of course the government department, when they are asking something about tax returns. PR department, seeking information about the new rules from government departments. So these are all examples of external communication. So now, why is a strong communication network very important? It's important because it builds an effective team. And because there is an effective team which is communicating effectively, so there is an exchange of ideas which develops mutual trust, which is very important for business. It is also to give everybody a voice so they can offer their ideas and suggestions. So people have a sense of belonging and self-esteem in that organization. And of course, seeds of innovation because when you exchange ideas and suggestions, this leads to innovations, it leads to new strategies. It also leads to fast remedial action, which will boost the growth of an organization. Then leads to what every organization wants, perfect coordination from the management to the lowest cadre. So all work together for the benefit of the organization. So it's very important to have a strong communication network, especially in business. And here is a sort of diagram which will tell you all about this whole communication process. So sender, the message, the encoding, and the message could be a text written or spoken, then decoding, and how the receiver decodes the text. So this is basically what communication is all about. Now let's talk about the sender. The sender is obviously the person or party from which the message originates. May have different status, maybe high up in the hierarchy, lower down in the hierarchy. It can be an internal sender or an external sender, internal to the business or external to the business. Internal communication may originate from the director, manager, group leader, as I said, and a sender could also be lower level of hierarchy. And it could be in the context of external communication, it could be a vendor, supplier, customer. This I've already talked about. Then encoding. This intervenes between message and channel. While sending message, for example, especially in digital form, the message has to be converted into another language which is compatible with the electronic media. This change in format of message is called encoding. So encoding means to convert information into codes, and code is basically a system of symbol, sign or letter which is used to represent the meaning. So the code and the system are interrelated. So the type of encoding will depend on the media or the channel being used for transmission of message. And then we have the message. The message could be information, it could be ideas, it could be thought, opinion that a sender wants to send. So it could be any of these things. As I said, it depends on the status of the sender, whether the message is from inside the organization or outside business establishment. So the nature of the message will change. So if it's a message from a director or manager or a group leader, it will be maybe an order, it could be a suggestion, it could be appreciation, it could also be warning. And a junior it could be a complaint, it could be a request for the redressal of grievance. From a vendor outside, it could be a question or reminder. A message from retailer, it could be a request for supply of goods. From a customer, it could be a complaint about defect in product. So messages depend on whether you're sending from within the organization or whether you're talking about outside the organization. A communication channel is medium through which communication is sent to its intended receiver. So utmost care should be taken to set up appropriate communication channels so that the information flows quickly and correctly within and outside the organization. If you use an inappropriate channel, it leads to negative consequences. And of course, richer communication channels are used for complex messages to ensure clarity. Let's talk about various types of communication channels. So you have face-to-face communication channels. These are very popular in big business, and here they're popular because especially these days you use video conferencing. So you can communicate with staff without calling them to one place. So this saves time and avoids unnecessary disturbance. And you can also see the facial expressions and tone of voice of the speakers. There's less ambiguity, and the speakers and recipients both can ask each other questions and seek clarification. Of course, there is the mobile communication channel using smartphones, and this is probably for private or confidential messages. And then is of course the email, the electronic communication channels such as email, internet, intranet and social media platforms. And this is the least expensive. There's broadcast media communication, which is TV and radio, and this is often used for advertising of products. Then there is written method of communication, which is normally for policies, sending memos, letters, manual notices. Let's now talk about the receiver. So receiver is the intended target of business communication sent by sender. And there are 3 stages before the receiver can respond. For example, reception of the message. Let's look at that one. So if a business enterprise advertises a new product, it will attract desired customers only if it is received by customers in the right perspective. So perspective is very important. Then you have decoding of the message. So this encoded message that we talked about, language that we talked about, is reconverted with a readable, understandable message. So there are some actions, for example, that will be taken if the message is received properly. For example, if you take an advertisement and you want the advertisement to give some specific impressions to the viewer. So the advertisement will be successful only if the viewer is able to understand, that is, decode the message intended to be given through these actions. Otherwise, there'll be distortion. Then this business of understanding the message. So the message should be framed in such a manner that it serves its purpose. That is, it generates the impression on the reader as was the intention. Feedback, very, very important. After the receiver has received message, they normally send a response. They don't have to send, but they normally send a response. So, for example, if you take a marketing officer, the marketing officer collects sales data, the competitor's product, and prepares a report, makes suggestions, that is, should there be a decreasing price or should there be an offer, and then sends to the management, so a response. And the response sent to the sender is feedback of the whole process. So it is the ultimate result of a sequence of events initiated by the message originated from the sender. Feedback can be in both directions. It could be from the marketing officer to the manager or vice versa. And feedback is very important. In fact, the progress of business depends on useful feedback. Then we have barriers to communication, which distort or prevent communication. And they can be classified into 3 broad categories: personal barriers, environmental barriers, and mechanical barriers. Personal barriers are intrapersonal and interpersonal. So intrapersonal communication barriers are under 5 categories. It could be physiological barriers, that is, when you stammer, when there is a difficulty in hearing, or there is a personality problem. There is a psychological barrier when there is shyness, extreme shyness or nervousness, stage phobia. Attitudinal barriers, when somebody is an introvert, for example, or when you're not comfortable while communicating in the presence of many people. There are emotional barriers that if there is an adverse situation, you start crying instead of trying to resolve the crisis. And there's perceptual barriers. When people come from different backgrounds, they have different social backgrounds, especially cultural backgrounds. They have perceptions which are very different from each other. So these are the personal barriers. Then you have the interpersonal barriers or cultural barriers. Like, some people will stand very close to you. The body language will be something that you cannot understand. It will be intruding of you, intrusive body language. So these are cultural barriers. There are linguistic barriers as well, and especially when it is from one language to the other. For example, a Chinese trying to speak in English may not be very comfortable communicating in English and may not get his or her, whatever he or she is trying to say, may not be very effective. Then there are ethical barriers. For example, ethics come in conflict with professional performance. You're selling a product which has problems and you feel a little guilty about it. And then there's, of course, status barriers, where when you're communicating, when some people have a great sense of their status and they're not particularly comfortable when communicating with their juniors, or the juniors are not very comfortable communicating with their seniors. Environmental barriers. These are also divided into several categories. Physical barriers, so there's noise around you, technological barriers, so that the phone line may not be good, for instance, or the internet connection may be disrupted, or the message goes to spam. Then there's chromatic barriers, which is about delayed delivery of message due to some technological factors. Organizational barriers, there is poor communication facilities. That is things like internet, Wi-Fi, stationery is not updated regularly, so the employees are handicapped. Then there is a complex hierarchy within an office, so communication is difficult. Then there are cumbersome rules in an organization, so people do not feel comfortable. And sometimes there is an inefficient delivery network. For example, there is a receipt section. Mechanical barriers, we talked about transmission interruption, outdated instruments, power failure. How do you overcome these? It is just by some kind of basically taking some, if it's psychological and physiological barriers, you have to take external help. And to overcome interpersonal barriers, use simple language, be a patient listener, there should be workshops, and there should be simpler hierarchical setup. Then finally, we come to the principles of effective communication. There should be clarity of ideas. So that means first one should be fully informed before one can inform others. Use appropriate language. Do not get into jargon and technical words. Then consistency. Don't say too many things at the same time. Avoid that. Then give adequate information. And do not give incomplete facts, which will create confusion and irritation. Then communication should reach the receiver at proper time. A late delivery of communication may lose its relevance. So draw attention. Communication should be so worked that it draws attention of the receiver and he or she goes through it with attention. Then there should be a touch of informality. So even in formal interactions, there should be a touch of informality so that there is a positive, friendly environment. So many problems actually are solved through informal channels. If one is a little doubtful, especially if one is junior in the hierarchy, please consult appropriate authority before sending the communication. So communication should also take into consideration the future as well as the present circumstances in mind. And sender should seek feedback so that the future action can be planned. So in fact, this sums up what we expect you to do in the communication process. So I hope this was useful to you, and it will draw attention to many of the factors that you should keep in mind when you are communicating in the business sphere. Thank you very much.